One of the powers of Photoshop is to manipulate imagery in terms of a series of layers, and that requires us to make selections of particular aspects of an image. So when we're selecting parts of an image, what we need to think about is how we select. We've got a very simple tool, which is the rectangular marquee tool. If I click and drag over an area, I've now selected that area. If I copy and paste that area, nothing appears to have happened. But if we go to the layers palette over here, what you can see is that I've created a separate layer. If I look over here, there's a little eyeball which says this is a visible layer. So if I uncheck that for the moment, you can see that now I've got a separate layer on top of this layer. This particular layer is highlighted, which means that this particular layer is the active layer. If I now transform the hue of that, and that's Command U as a shortcut key, if I start to manipulate this, I'm only manipulating the colour of this particular hue. Clearly, if I switch off that background, you can see that it's only background here, this particular layer, that's been manipulated. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to get rid of that particular layer. So we'll hit the wastebasket, which will delete that layer. Now, whenever a tool has a little tiny triangle in the corner of it, and you'll see that on a number of these little tabs, it means that there are other tools underneath it. So I can look at the elliptical tool. If I was to click and drag over an area, I would have created an ellipse. Now that area is selected. If I copy and paste that, what you'll see here is that I've copied obviously this ellipse. Whenever you're using the elliptical tool or the rectangular marquee tool, if you hold the shift key down when you click and drag, then you'll create a perfect circle. If I go click and drag for the moment, nothing happens. And the reason for that is that my active layer is here and there's nothing in this layer. If I come back to here and now go copy and paste, then what you'll see is I've now created a second layer. If I go back to my original image, making sure that this layer is active, change my selection to a rectangular marquee tool, but hold the shift key down, I'll create a perfect square. And again, if I now copy and paste, that's Command C and Command V on your keypad, you can see I've created another layer. So each of these layers is now independent of each other. If I switch the background off, you can see that these are independent. If I go to the Move tool, you can see with this layer highlighted, I can move this rectangle. If I move to this layer, I can move this circle. Now when you're moving between layers, it's sometimes really useful to have this checked, auto select, which means that I can click on this particular element and move that layer, click on this one to move that. Otherwise, if that's unchecked and I'm trying to select this ellipse up here, I won't be able to select it. I'm actually selecting the circle underneath here because it's the circle layer that's active. Sometimes when you're working on lots of layers, it's quite useful to label. So here I can just label that this is my circle layer and this is my ellipse layer. And this is my square layer. Not so difficult when you're only working with 4 layers in total. But when you're working on many layers, it is useful to be able to kind of identify what you're doing. So each of these layers is independent, which again means that if I select this layer, I can transform it. So I can transform it in terms of levels. And again, it's only that layer that's been applied. I could invert that image. That's going to give me the complementary colour of that. That's Command and I on your shortcut key. Or I could transform, that's Command and T, this particular layer. And again, if I now go to Command U, nothing will happen because I haven't applied my transformation, so I'll apply that. If I now hit Command U, I can now change the, obviously, the saturation of that particular layer and its hue. Now, in terms of the image is made up of a series of layers, and the order of those layers is from top to bottom. So the background layer is the bottom layer, the ellipse up here is the top layer. I can change the order of these by moving them accordingly. You won't really see much difference. It will become much more obvious when we move this element here, and you can now see that that is underneath the ellipse. If I moved it to the top, it will cover the ellipse up. I can move the ellipse back to the top there, or I could choose to put the circle back on top. And again, if I move the circle now, you can see that I've placed the layer above all else. So I can move my layers around. My background layer, clearly I can't manipulate my background layer. It's fixed for the moment. However, what I could do is I could select all of that, that's Command A. I could copy that, I could paste that, in which case now I've got another layer, which is the same as my background. I could bring that to the top, and obviously at the moment that's covered everything up. But each layer, as I click on each layer, also has another control, and that's its opacity. So if I now change the opacity of that top layer, we'll start to see through to subsequent layers beneath. If I switch the background off, you can see how that now shows much more the transparency. This checkerboard pattern is not a part of the image that will print, it just simply shows you the background. I'll put that background in. So it's the ability to select various bits of the layers and move them around that's really important.